Hello and welcome to the podcast, Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. My name is Ben and with me as always is...
Jim. It's Jim. Or is it John Murphy? I don't know. I'm not sure what my
Is it
my
Murphy
name
or
is.
Murdoch?
Oh, Murdoch. Sorry, I got it wrong already. I'm like, did I even watch this movie? I don't know.
So this movie in question is Dark City, released in 1950, starring Charlton Heston, Elizabeth... Wrong Dark City. Wrong Dark City. Did you know there are 8 Dark Cities listed on IMDb?
I did not know that, but honestly, I'm not surprised. Okay, as a film title,
short films. Most of them are short films. But yeah, no, okay, so Dark City, released 1998, coincidentally or not, a year before The Matrix. Directed by Alex Proyas, Australian. Did The Crow, iRobot, Knowing, and Gods of Egypt. Yeah, if you noticed, like I did, it seems like he starts up here and kind of goes like this. I don't often list cinematographers, but I'm going to this time, and I'm going to mispronounce his name. I do apologize. Dariusz Wolski. The reason I mention it is when I research these things, every once in a while I find something interesting. And this dude, I had no idea he existed, but he has done Pirates of the Caribbean, Dark City, Alice in Wonderland, Prometheus, The Martian, Alien Covenant, House of Gucci, Napoleon. He's doing Nuremberg coming up. He's one of those people that has shaped movies we love and love the look of, and I just never knew his name.
It's interesting. I knew him from Pirates of the Caribbean. You know, in particular, I think that and it's weird to like single out, you know, a film when it's a series, but some of the cinematography work on Dead Man's Chest, the second Pirates of the Caribbean movie, was so good that I, at that point, went down just a rabbit hole of who is this guy?
Yeah.
Like, you know, but what's interesting is, you know, I really know him from, I forgot that he shot this movie basically. But I know him from Pirates of the Caribbean, which is a totally different visual style to what we're dealing with here in Dark City. And, you know, both really, you know, visual feasts, but in completely different ways. So I think that's, you know, that's really cool to see someone who's obviously so versatile and knows their craft so well that they can just hop between styles and create a totally different look and do both of those looks so well. So if you're not sure, by the way, you know, if you're like cinematographer, what's that? You know, the cinematographer is the person who is responsible for the visual image that hits your eyeballs, right? So dealing with the camera department and the lighting department, and in order to compose shots, light shots, and oversee the visual look of the movie. So, and obviously a movie like Dark City that we're talking about today, or a movie that we just referenced, Pirates of the Caribbean, that series, these are visual feasts. So this is there's some skill here. There's some real skill here. But look, continue. Who else was involved?
Starring Rufus Sewell, who it took me a while to place him. A Knight's Tale. He's the prince in A Knight's Tale. He's also the bad guy in a lot of movies. Keith Sullivan, Jennifer Connelly, Richard O'Brien, Ian Richardson, and William Hurt. This is a movie. So Rufus Sewell, it's kind of his first starring role. All the movies before this, he was either a bit part or it was a very small production of like a TV show or something like that. So what a wild first movie to kind of be the lead on. Budget, 27 million, and box office, 27.2 million. This movie broke even. And actually, in reality, if we know films enough, didn't break even. It lost money. Yeah, so plot. Now, bear with me here. Because this movie is a wildcat. The main character, John Murdoch, wakes up in a bathtub with no memory. He gets a mysterious phone call saying, hey, you've got to leave the apartment. You're being blamed for a murder you didn't do. Walks into the next room, sees the murder. The person who's calling him is the doctor, who is Keith Sullivan. He is told to run from these people called the Strangers, who are kind of pale white men. Most of them are tall and thin. There is one real creepy child. He goes on the run. He doesn't know who he is or why he is. Throughout the process of the film, we find out that the memories of everyone in the city are planted and created. They're not their own memories. They are overwritten time and time again by these people called the Strangers, who have this ability called tuning, which is basically a psychic power to manipulate the environment around them. Turns out our main character, John, also has the ability to tune, and that makes him very dangerous, or the answer to the problem of these strangers, which is they can no longer live. They're dying as a species. So after a few different adventures, after a cop, William Hurt, investigating him for the murders that he didn't really commit, but everyone thinks he committed, he ends up in this situation where he wants to get to a beach, but the beach isn't real. It's in everybody's collective memories. Jennifer Connelly's his wife. He ends up getting strapped to a machine, getting pumped full of memories that teaches him how to use the gift of tuning, fights against the strangers, rewrites the world, and saves humanity, who, spoilers, all along, hasn't been on Earth, has been on a giant floating spaceship pointed away from the sun because the strangers do not like the sun or water. He turns it towards the sun. It is no longer a dark city scene.
Look, clap, clap, clap. That is very well done, sir. Like when we sort of, a few podcasts ago, when, it became clear that, we should do these plot synopses, in full at the top of each cast. This is one where it was your pick, Dark City, and I wasn't really itching to do the plot synopsis for this one because that was, it's a crazy tale, it's a crazy movie, and it's a kind of movie that it's interesting because you sort of say all that and you go, well, what genre are we, right? It's quite interesting from that perspective because the fact that the strangers are, as we've said, spoiler, are aliens, functionally. They're aliens. We are basically on a spaceship. It's just a spaceship that looks like a city, and we're hurtling through space. So you'd say, sure, well, we're science fiction, right? However, tonally, the movie looks like a film noir movie, from the 1940s and 50s. So it's that dark detective story. Also, the first half of the movie, from a story perspective, is also following a lot of our film noir beats, which is, film noir, if you're not familiar, is a film style called, film black, noir being French for black. And it was really popular in the 1940s and then into the 50s, black and white films, detective stories.
Maltese Falcon, those sort of movies.
Exactly. So it's a detective story, usually shot in black and white, with a very distinct and moody lighting style. And it had a few tropes. There was a female character called a femme fatale. There was a detective who was hot on the case of, some sort of criminal activity. And it was sort of very shady, underhanded dealings. Now, the first half of this movie basically behaves like a film noir plot. And then the more you learn about the strangers and the more you learn about the fact that, John Murdoch's world is not real, the film then transitions, and the back half of the movie is much more science fiction, and what is this world, and uncovering that kind of world. And that is a really interesting and odd kind of balancing act for the film to perform, because I should clarify, it's not like the film does a complete left turn. There's hints the whole way through.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
If you watch this movie, or if you haven't watched this movie, watch the director's cut. And it's for one reason and one reason only. They ruined this movie with a opening explanation. So when this movie was made, it was made without the kind of opening narration. And the studio's like, hey, no one's going to understand this. You got to put an opening narration. The opening narration kind of spoils the mystery of this film to a large extent.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I would completely agree with you, because the all these reveals that are designed to be drip fed to the audience and then pushed at certain times are basically all just revealed in the opening 30 seconds of the film via this narration.
Yeah, it explains the environment, which is the fun of this movie, is you don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
So
It's also odd too because it's almost word for word. I wouldn't be surprised if it's just repurposed dialogue from later in the film.
yeah,
You know, it may not be, but it's literally there's an explanation that occurs about halfway through the film from Kiefer Sutherland's character, who also does the opening narration, where he explains the mechanics of the world and what's going on, and it's basically exactly the same as the first 30 seconds. So, you know, much as I don't really understand why the studio thought that they needed to put it there, because it's not like it wasn't explained, unless they were literally concerned people were going to walk out,
I think
like
it was almost cowardly, to be honest. They obviously didn't. The audience that was going to find this film, regardless of narration or not, was going to find this film. It, by all definitions, wasn't a success and has become a cult classic, right? Like, it is the definition. Like, it has its dedicated audience now. It has people who are proponents for it, but that's 20 years later. Like, someone watched this movie, goes, I don't get it, put something at the start, and that's it. And the thing is, it's one of those movies, it's okay not to get it. Like, I've watched this movie maybe 5 to 8 times in my life. Every time at the end of the movie, I'm like, what happened? For a different reason, though. Like, it's a fun what happened. It's not like that movie made no sense to me. It's like, oh, I got something different out of it. I didn't get the same thing I got last time. And I think that's what it was a knee-jerk reaction to, in my opinion. I couldn't tell you for sure. But it's...
It's just a strange choice because I agree with you. That's probably why it exists. But again, that seems like a really lazy choice too, because it's also like the exact same explanation is given at a different point in the movie.
If you just wait.
If you just wait, you get the same info. That studio exec, presumably, who's like, hey, we need an opening narration. I'm like, did they even finish watching their rough cut? Like, because probably not. They probably got, 40 minutes in and went, I don't get it. What is it about? Turned to the person next to them and said, oh, the aliens come later. Put the aliens at the start,
and I do really want to hammer this forward. If you haven't really watched this, it's not an alien heavy movie.
No.
It's more like just they happen to be aliens. That is the explanation for what they are, the strangers. Also, it is a very Kafka-esque movie in that it's not always pleasant to watch. It is deliberately challenging what is a comfortable film to watch. It's unpleasant, it's frightening, it's confusing. But again, I think it's why I'm drawn to it. It's, when you have something and it's like too sour, and you go, oh man, that was awful. And then about 30 seconds later, you're like, I want to do it again. I want to have the sour thing in. This is what this movie is a bit like to me. Like, it's like, wow, yeah, that little kid bit his finger. That's real weird. Or, oh, that's the spirals are unpleasant. Or the constant dark mood in this movie doesn't make me feel comfortable. But after finishing it and you sit with it for a day, you're like, oh yeah, I could watch it again, maybe in about 6 months. Like, I really could.
Yeah, look, I really like Dark City, but I particularly like film noir. I like movies that sort of have a lot of different things to say in terms of their reveals and whatnot. And this has that. The things that I don't like about the film, because there are a few of those too, much as I'm here for Dark City, I'm a fan of Dark City, there's a few things that I actually don't like very much. And none of them really are to do with the plot. The plot, as you described, I think works perfectly well.
Yeah.
It's set up and payoff. It's, I love the visual mood of the movie. The main problems that I have with the film are actually to do with the lead character of John Murdoch, and his kind of journey. It's this very... It's a tricky thing whenever you have a film where the main conceit is that the character has functionally amnesia, and that's really what we're dealing with here, is a character who is told he's a murderer, but he has no memory of performing the murders. And then it sort of goes a bit of a layer deeper, where later in the film you find out, well, they're not even actually his memories, they were implanted memories. So it's sort of like, he A, can't remember who he is, B, he's told he's a murderer, and then C, but they're not actually his memories anyway. So what it means is we don't have a lot of time to actually work out who is John Murdoch. Is he a good person? Is he a bad person?
We
Is he
never
a
know.
person we actually don't know? Like,
No.
and it makes his motivation very, very difficult to determine in the movie. His motivation changes from scene to scene, and that's not really a bad thing. It's just because he's constantly finding out different layers of his life as being not real or not what he thought, it means that he's constantly seeking this motivation for, well, what do I want, and what am I trying to achieve? In the end, his motivation comes from the plot, of
Yes.
once we determine that there are aliens in this city and that humanity is functionally being used as an experiment, Murdoch's goal becomes to stop that from happening. And why stop it from happening? Well, I guess to just stop it. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, he could actually, the thing is, he knows so little about the world around him. By stopping the aliens, he could actually be killing everybody. Like, he has no way of knowing whatsoever. Like, and there's no time to actually pause and for him to even reflect upon that. He basically just goes from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing, being like, I think this is a good idea. I think this is a good idea.
The two characters in this film that are self-motivated are William Hurt's detective and Keith O'Sullivan's doctor, right? In reality, in most films, one of those two would be the protagonist because they have a self-propelling story. Yes, we find out that William Hurt is also an implanted memory. He's doing what he thinks is his own thing, but it's not. But then Keith O'Sullivan is a self-motivated character, makes choices in this movie that leads to the downfall of the villains or the strangers, right? He's actually the person who is in control of the destiny of this film. Like, he knows what's going on at all times. He's flawed, he's scared, he's a coward, he's a narcissist, he's all these things, but like, he's the one who actually affects the change in this movie. And it's a weird thing for a character who is definitely not the main character that is presented in this film.
Well, look, I know you usually bring the trivia, but you may or may not be aware that early drafts of the script had William Hurt's character, the detective, as the lead of the movie.
I am aware. Interesting.
To me, honestly, the film works the best when William Hurt is actually on screen doing his work as the detective, trying to hunt down John Murdoch and then work out what's going on with the world. Like, so the fact that the movie is the strongest when he is doing that, maybe shows that perhaps, and who knows, you would completely restructure the film if you changed who the lead was, but maybe that is actually a better choice, or a more fitting choice for the audience. Now, that said, this movie is trying to be strange at almost every turn. So making, if you say, well, it was expected that the detective was going to be the lead, let's make it the criminal, and then he's not the criminal, and then he's the other, maybe that's part of the charm of the film. We'll never know, because such a huge rewrite would have to take place in order to make the detective the lead. But it is interesting that in its finished form, when William Hurt is on screen trying to track down the murderer and work out what's wrong with his world, things seem to work better, and things seem to fit a lot better. So
I agree with you that, I read the same thing about how, like, it was a 1940s detective who was obsessed with facts, and, like, as he keeps looking into this case, he can't find facts to explain it, starts to go crazy, starts to investigate his world, which in a strange way is what we get in this movie as a whole, but just not driven by him as a character. And Alex Proyas obviously wrote more characters, started to like other ones differently, liked the way the angle of the movie took when he switched that kind of, hey, it's the guy being chased, not the chaser, who is in charge of the plot of this film. I also, just a little side note, really fun game to play in this movie if you're Australian is Spot the Australian Bit Actor. It is thoroughly enjoyable. There are strangers, there are cops, there are side characters who are just Australian actors that I've seen on TV since I was a child playing these kind of real character pieces in this movie. Like there's a character we haven't mentioned yet. I forget his name. He's basically the first cop who took this case of these murders, right? And he goes crazy. Hence what we were talking about before. But he doesn't go crazy. He goes crazy like a fox in that he works it out. And because he worked it out, he's insane. Like he knows everything that's going on in this film. But it broke him. I love that character. He's like, you can't escape. It's a circle. Like he's worked out that they're in a container, basically. He's worked out that their lives are manipulated. He's worked out he's not who he thinks he is. Other people aren't who they are. Because like Murdoch, he woke up. He got interrupted in his sleeps. But yeah, no, he's one of my favorite. He's an Australian actor. That's what made me think about it.
Yeah, that's Colin Friels, I think is his name. We've also got David Wenham shows up in a very small couple of line roles. Bald as a one of the strangers. Bruce Spence is there as one of the strangers as well. Like
he's there quite a bit.
So it is pretty cool. Melissa George shows up at one point, like, all these Australian actors who, we're very familiar with. And yes, it is quite fun to actually sort of see them in this kind of movie, put together. I do want to talk a little bit about the kind of what would you say, Jennifer Connelly's character. So
yeah,
Jennifer Connelly's character in the movie is also a really strange character because
she's a plot point.
She's a plot point, but she's got implanted. So she plays John Murdoch's wife, right?
Yeah.
Except we find out then not his wife because her memories are implanted as well. Yet she's also still quite devoted to him throughout the movie and trying to sort of, look after him and get back to him. And it just makes it very, very difficult to sort of sympathize with that when we're then told that that's a completely constructed reality. And those two characters don't have really hardly any time together to try and go, okay, well, that was a constructed reality, but how are you, and do we actually connect here, or is this all just implanted memories?
There's a hurdle in this movie in general that I think you have to get over, and I think it helps a little bit with this. It doesn't make it more comfortable to view or to understand. So I don't know if I explained it properly. The aliens are basically tinkering with mankind because the aliens are a hive mind and they don't understand individuality. In the movie, they're changing things and implanting scenarios and memories and ideas and seeing how they play out so that they can understand individuality and humanity because they think it'll help them survive because they're a dying race. So this whole thing of like the implanted memories and the motivations of the characters, I think them being kind of puppets, in my opinion, is the point, right? It's like the aliens miss the point. The aliens don't get it. They're trying to create these fabricated scenarios, these motivations, these emotions, these reactions to understand. Whereas if they just watched humanity in its bare nakedness, let it flow, you would get a lot more out of it. So the tinkering is removing the humanity from the characters, which is, I think, what you're feeling. So the in-world removing of these people's true histories, their true stories, their true motivations, making true choices, the aliens removing that, I think, is what's creating that disconnect for you with the characters in the story, because they feel empty.
That's right. It makes it very difficult to actually, follow characters, sympathize with characters, actually connect with characters, which you need to do in a movie in order to actually sort of progress, and because there's so much plot in the film doesn't really slow down and let you actually sit with the characters or let the characters work out who they are. It just sort of moves us on to the next thing. And it's funny because it doesn't feel rushed. I'm not actually saying the movie has a pacing problem. I'm just saying that the characters don't know who they are, and they don't know why they're behaving certain ways, yet they continue to progress and be together and behave in certain ways. And almost, it kind of makes the end of the movie actually a little bit creepy for me. Because
it's real unfortunate because go explain.
So it's at the end of the film, basically the only person who kind of remembers what's going on and where everything's at is John Murdoch, who reshapes the world and creates this place he's been trying to get to of Shell Beach. And Emma Murdoch, who is, actually doesn't
no longer
remember
Emma Murdoch either.
She's no longer Emma Murdoch. She's now a character called Anna, because during the course of sort of the finale, she gets her memories wiped and turns into a new person. So Jennifer Connelly's character, was playing his wife and devoted to him. And then by the end of the movie, she doesn't remember who he is. He then, remembering, their connection, seeks her out and kind of like tries to sort of start flirting with her. Reintroduces himself. But again, it's kind of creepy because he's got all this information.
You know why he's doing it.
Yeah, like he's clearly trying to provoke a romantic connection. And it's like, well, she doesn't know who you are and you have all this information about her. It kind of, the analogy turns to like stalkerish. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I know all about you and I know what you love and what you like, and I'm going to try and manipulate that and get you to like me. And I'm like, just like, not really, for the hero of the story, like to sort of, just for it to play out that way,
It's also the subtext of the scene. It's not how the character plays it out. He's quite like, hey, like, you're here, I'm going to the lighthouse. And she goes, oh, I was going that way, I'll come with you. Like, it's not, it's creepy in its nature. I don't think it's necessarily written creepy. I don't know, it's hard to explain.
It's difficult. And look, I look at that one and I go, I wonder if the performances were different, if we would perhaps feel differently about the scene. It's a very difficult thing for Rufus Sewell to play, because there's so much going on. It's possible that there's a version of this as written, played a slightly different way, which isn't giving creeper vibes, but the version that we saw, I definitely had that.
He's also effectively become this world's god.
Yeah.
This world cannot function without him. He's in complete control of it. He, at any point, has absolute power over the lives of all these people. And the basic premise, not presented in this film, but the basic premise of humanity is absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. Like, there's going to be a time where he's just going to want something and he's going to take it.
And that is also the trick there. And particularly when we look at, and I don't want to get too deep on this, but, if we look at that final sequence, and we look at it from a sort of romantic perspective, the power imbalance, if we look at the fact that he is basically the god of this world and she has no memory and he has all the cards, if we look at like, just in terms of the power discrepancy, between them, I'm like, it kind of makes any romantic connection not okay between
he literally
characters.
Let there be light. Like, the metaphor, I think, is deliberate. But and you're right, the power discrepancy and the lack of knowledge that she has is more importantly. It's a weird place to leave the movie when something heroic has just happened.
It's tricky too, because you can look at it and go, oh, well, this and this and this. But then you also look at it and go, we got to wrap up the movie. He did save the world. Do you know what I mean? Like,
he needs a reward.
We want the male lead and the female lead to get together. It's a movie, right? So there's certain things where you get how they got there. Do you know what I mean? It's just that by the time we get there, it doesn't look quite right, with what we would sort of want to see in that situation. I want to mention one other thing as well. This movie doesn't happen if John Murdoch doesn't magically, and it is magically, develop the ability to tune, to do what the strangers can do. It is never explained why he got that power, at one point, one of the strangers goes, it would take, you know, many of your lifetimes to develop this ability. It's like, well, okay, but he hasn't had that. So what happened? How did you do it? What occurred to actually, make this something that you can do that no one else can do? And it's just never explained, and it must occur for the movie to work. If it doesn't happen, the movie doesn't work. So
it tries weakly to explain it. Like, it's like they give the whole like, hey, like, he's doing it originally as a defense mechanism, reflex. He's not consciously choosing to tune. And it's like, hey, like, yeah, he's evolved. He's the next step. Like, this is what you were trying to achieve. You were trying to create this connection between humanity and yourself, and you've done it. And when he's like, oh, it would take a lifetime for him to do that, well, that's effectively exactly what happens in the end of the movie. He gets given a lifetime of memories from the doctor on how to tune. So he gets that in the space of an injection. So yeah, they kind of try to explain it, and then they just ignore it for the rest of the film. There's like a throwaway line of like, hey, no, this is what you were trying to do the whole time. And then they're like, no, we don't like it. And you gotta go. It's like, but this is what we don't like it. It's this whole, it's a very throwaway kind of 5 minutes of the film collectively. It's not all in one place of them like, hey, like, this is how this has happened. But yeah, they don't try very hard to explain it or to even justify it. A thing I want to bring up is the look of the film, primarily the physical location. So this whole film is on constructed sets in studio. And there are times when movies do that and it's jarring and it doesn't fit, but it's actually exactly what this movie needs. It's a weird one, right? So it looking like a constructed set sometimes, or like a backlot street or something like that, is exactly what this city is in the fiction of the story. It is a constructed environment that changes based on the needs of the people running it. And I actually thought it was a really nice touch that they obviously, at points in this movie, took deliberate steps to leave it look like a backlot or a set in parts, like this kind of weird, like when they're on the canal, right, and they're going through to the wall. It's very much strikes me as behind the scenes of a set, right? It's like the bits they don't care about, so it's all half built or just it's the back of the facade. And I thought I really, really dug it. And I actually started looking at the background a lot more about halfway through this movie of like, hey, like, I think it's a deliberate choice that, yes, they did it all on sets, but they left it to look like it was constructed and temporary.
I gotta say, like, and we probably haven't talked enough about the visual look of the movie. If there's any Dark City fans watching, or listening to this podcast, they're probably like, "What are you guys doing? You're not even talking about."
Yeah.
It looks amazing, right? You know, and honestly, the reported budget for this movie is like $27 million, and even in 1998 money, I don't know how they did it. Like, it's like a magic trick to actually, and sure, yes, some of the visual effects look quite dated now, but at the same time, I'm like, that was a lot of money in 1998 dollars to do even those visual effects, which now look very dated. Combine that with the completely constructed world where you get nothing for free, you have to build everything, and I look at it and I also just go, we're shooting in Australia, which doubly means you get nothing for free when you're shooting what is supposed to be an American city. So everything must be detailed and must be actually created because, Australian cities and American cities do not look the same, particularly in the 1990s. It's getting a little more similar now. But
very much so. There was no Batman building back then.
Yeah. And that's right. Yeah. But also, and look, sure, this is then, sort of this strange 1940s period piece, which again is another level where you say, well, you get nothing for free. You have to build everything, right? Or repurpose it. And I look at the $27 million price tag and I'm like, but how? How did you do it? How did you actually get that much bang for your buck from a visual standpoint in this movie, because there's just so much going on visually. And then at the end, we have this crazy, like, Akira style, fight where they're flying up and flying around the city, and there's huge like aerial shots, well, not really aerial, but from outer space shots of the floating city, and the buildings are crashing down, and I'm like, how did we do all this for $27 million? What sorcery is in place to actually
It's a visual achievement and masterpiece is literally the only way I can put it. Like, even without the backhand knowledge that we have of like, hey, this is usually really expensive. When this was made, this was an achievement. Even the datedness of this film works to serve the story of the film. Like the dated effects. They don't pull you out of it. Once you know about the world, they actually, I think, tighten up the world a little bit. Now, the visual aspect of this movie, the language, the story, the structure, did the Wachowskis borrow? Look, it came out a year before. The Wachowskis would have been developing The Matrix already.
Yeah. But I think, and look, so there's sort of a famous kind of story, which is that The Matrix basically bumped in straight after Dark City to these studios and actually did reuse some of the sets. I feel like, and look, that's basically all we know. That one line is, we know that they reused some of the sets. Now, we can kind of guess, if you know The Matrix at all, that the opening probably 25 minutes of The Matrix does have some pretty clear film noir overtones and sort of that kind of shady kind of look, and some of the imagery is the same, particularly when, if you know The Matrix, where Trinity is racing over the rooftops and having that fight against the first agent. I would imagine that, look, the Matrix team would have got there and literally been like, don't strike the set, we can actually use that. That actually just fits, and we can save some money by just, maybe it's a little bit more film noir than we were going to go for that particular sequence, but we can use it, right? So, because I think that's kind of how it happened. I don't necessarily think that, because again, as you say, they were too far into production to actually sort of steal ideas, if you like. It would have just, I think at worst or at best, however you want to look at it, it would have just been a thrifty repurpose of, we have a scene that does XYZ, we could totally use that set,
There's another similarity that I actually hadn't connected the dots to before watching it again this time, between this and The Matrix. And that is with Mr. Hand and Agent Smith.
Yeah, so that idea that the
break away from the construction they're in, develop their own individuality because of a contamination from the real world. Like in The Matrix, Agent Smith gets blown apart by Keanu Reeves. Wow, Neo. And in the movie Dark City, Mr. Hand gets the memories or the fake memories that John Murdoch would have received, and they both become corrupted.
Yeah, they become corrupted. They kind of go a little bit crazy. They go off mission, and it's a very, very
different results in the end.
Yeah,
it's just
there was something in the water in the late 90s, though, Ben, because you had this string of movies. You had Dark City, The Matrix, The Truman Show, and they're all hitting in like this tail end of the 90s, the last sort of 3 years of the 1990s, and they're all saying the same thing: constructed world, things aren't what you think. Let's get to the truth, and it's basically just bam, 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 1, 2, 3. Unfortunately, for Dark City, they were the least successful of those 3 examples, but
I think they went the hardest in a non-consumer direction, though.
Yeah.
Like, if you look at the other movies, The Truman Show is talking about our reality and us shaping our reality. The Matrix is talking about a similar thing to Dark City, but it's also giving superpowers to everybody. And it's kind of like there's a power fantasy for the humans in this, as well as the machines or whatever. Also, the memories of the humans aren't implanted or wrong. They don't have the full picture. Whereas this, you're delving much more into the psychological and the kind of the id of the piece, rather than like The Matrix, which has the action movie with the other stuff underneath.
And it's it's just interesting that that period contains all these films. Like you could even bundle Memento and Fight Club into that same
100%.
category, and just sort of say what something was happening here. Like that filmmakers were trying to tell these types of stories. But
I mean, I think we're also at that time in history, we're coming into what we now know as the internet age. Like we were learning about a world that was rapidly expanding both knowledge-wise and connection-wise to the rest of the world. And I think maybe these are the responses to that, right? It's the responses to our world is becoming bigger. Our world is becoming more connected. We're coming out of this cocoon of isolation, and at any time we can now reach across the planet and see what's going on. And I think maybe that's in part to do why these movies exist, right? They're challenging the perception of reality because at that point in time, our reality was changing. And since then, it has been changing faster than in any point in human history.
Yeah.
So that's my opinion. So we're getting to the end part of this. I do really want to say I love this movie. It has flaws, but as Jim said earlier, it moves at a great pace for great reasons. It has great themes. It has an amazing visual language. Like this movie is a feast. Like you can look in the corner of a scene and see something that's interesting that has nothing to do with the scene, but just has to do with the world. And as a kid who grew up reading fantasy novels, for the main reason of I love the worlds, this gives me that. I like an interesting world. And Dark City just knocks it out of the park in that point, I think.
And look, I'd have to agree with you. I mean, it may seem like, upon reflection, I've picked it apart a little bit, but
that's the point.
But honestly, I love this film. Like, this was a film where one of the ones where you said I picked Dark City. I'm like, well, I don't need to work out where I'm going to watch that because I own Dark City because I love Dark City. Do you know what I mean? Like,
you can watch it for free on SBS Now in Australia.
Well, there you go. So, but like, it's the kind of thing where I love a film noir movie. Like I said, I've already talked about the visual style and said it looks fantastic. I like all the actors involved. I enjoy the type of plot of, our world is maybe not what it seems. I think the reveal is cool. Some of the character stuff, just due to the conceit of the movie, makes it difficult for it to hang together. But again, they're in a tough situation there. And ultimately, we've said this movie wasn't a success, but we should clarify, it wasn't a success at the time. I think, honestly, now you would say, they've more than made their money back and got their, cultural mileage out of Dark City, because this film is really quite well regarded now and has quite a large following. So, even that idea of, well, it wasn't successful. It's like, well, kind of, but really long term, pretty successful,
Yeah, look, if you haven't seen this movie, you're insane for listening to this podcast. But again, just a reminder, if you can find it, find the director's cut. It's not dramatically different except for the narration at the start. You don't need the narration, especially since you've listened to this podcast as well.
Yeah. If you've listened to this podcast, you've done worse than having just the opening narration.
If you're going to show it to somebody else, which, hey, that's some of the most fun with movies like this, show them the version without the narration. So, Jim, you have a decision to make. I'd like to point out I'm frightened because I received a series of text messages basically clarifying what is a movie. And that's horrifying when I host a movie podcast with my friend and we take turns picking movies. So
I was basically, prior to this podcast where I would reveal to Ben what the next pick was going to be, I was basically trying to clarify the rules for what we were and weren't allowed to pick.
Which is wild when I tried to pick a documentary, by the way.
I should say I love documentaries. I watch them a fair bit, but for this podcast, we've decided to not go that direction. So I was asking,
we've decided. I put quotation marks for people listening.
I was asking questions, about the type of thing we could pick, because I had a couple of films that I just thought would be super interesting to revisit, and I don't know if Ben has seen them. So look, without any further ado, I'm going to announce what we're going to be looking at next. And it is a slight deviation for us in that we haven't looked at this type of film before. We're going to look at the 2001 Walt Disney feature animation film called Atlantis: The Lost Empire.
I have seen this movie, and I think I've seen this movie. Because I know that you were obsessed with this movie at a point in time.
I do. Look, this movie, aside from just as a film, there's so much about it that is fascinating to me from a behind the scenes perspective, and I do really enjoy rewatching it from time to time. There's a ton of behind the scenes stuff about it that makes it a super interesting watch, but also I do think it's quite an enjoyable watch just as a film as well. But it's definitely a bit of a left turn for us. So this is a film that is it's interesting because you'd call it a 2D traditional animation film, except
it has 3D elements.
It has huge 3D elements, all the way through it. And it's also a film that, and we'll get into this on the next cast, but once you watch it, if you're watching along with us when we do each of these, it's a film where it struggled to find an audience because Disney was coming out of the 1990s where they were making all of these musicals, which were for families. And they were saying, I wonder if we could actually hit a teenage audience while retaining a 2D animation style. And look, they weren't the only studio trying to do this at this exact time of those early 2000s.
Treasure Planet.
Treasure Planet was a big one. Titan AE was another one. There was a number of studios experimenting with this idea, and the results are nothing if not fascinating. So Atlantis: The Lost Empire, we're going to watch it and we will report back with our findings. So I don't know if Ben's happy about this or not, but I don't care because it's great.
I've watched this movie before. It's been a while. I don't really remember it. So I'm keen to watch it again. I like animation quite a lot. Any background on me, I watch anime. I watch animated films. I like Toy Story. Jim does not like Toy Story.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Atlantis: The Lost Empire next week. Watch it if you haven't watched it. Join us on our next podcast. Remember to like, comment, subscribe on the platform that you are listening or watching on. You can find us on YouTube, Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. You can find us on iTunes and Spotify, Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. Also, give us a like over on Instagram on Jim and Ben's Adventures. You can see what upcoming movies we have. I usually post a little thing about each movie as well. Thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast. Thank you for inflicting our next movie, Atlantis: The Lost Empire, upon us, Jim. And everyone, have a great day.
Peace out. Bye-bye.